Welcome to Once Upon a Coin, documenting the ongoing history of blockchain and cryptocurrency. And as always, I'm your storyteller, Jason Cassidy. I'm gonna level with you here right from the start. Today's story is probably the most important episode you're ever gonna watch in this entire series. It touches upon some of the most basic yet cherished principles that we enjoy as human beings. Freedoms. The freedom to transact with who we wish. The freedom of movement. The freedom to privacy, and a lot more rights that, frankly, many of us have taken for granted in recent years. Technology can be a wonderful thing, liberating us as a species. Technology can also be a terrible thing when used as a tool of brutal enforcement. We're about to find out what happens when governments, with all the power that they can exert, decide to officially get into the crypto game for themselves. This is the story of Central Bank Digital Currencies.
Sun cast a shadow, a digital line is coming over the mountain and over your mind. Go down your Bitcoin, hang on for the ride. We're moving into the future, one block at a time. One block at a time.
The story of Central Bank Digital Currencies, or CBDCs as they're more commonly referred to, is quite an old one. It's as old as time itself, as governments have seemingly always desired to have some level of control over the currency that backed their nation. What has taken the role of money has evolved over the centuries. Whether it was stones, tally sticks, or some ink printed on a piece of paper, humans have always created a way of engaging in commerce. And with each currency came some form of governance behind it. And this often led to some conflicts as eventually people felt they were getting a raw deal. Whether it was oppressive taxation, capital controls, or the value of money being reduced through the inflation of the currency itself, history is rife with discord around these topics. In the present era, we are currently going through a transition. And that transition is moving away from physical cash, which you can hold in your hand, to virtual cash, which is relatively frictionless. But so far, that virtual money that's sitting in our online banking accounts has mimicked physical cash in the sense that it didn't have any special abilities attached to it. But due to the advent of blockchain technology, now new forms of money are being created that do have special abilities. And with a non-trivial amount of people around the world having heard about at least Bitcoin by now, the concept of cryptocurrencies is slowly becoming part of our new normal. So it was only a matter of time before governments around the planet took their national currencies and wanted to give them a cryptographic makeover. This is the essence of central bank digital currencies. Taking a nation's existing digital currency, be it the dollar, the yen, the yuan, the ruble, and upgrading it via blockchain tech. Central banks have been issuing digital currency for a while now, but so far that money hasn't been programmable. Programmable money gives the true owner of that currency a heck of a lot of control over those who use it. And from the government side, they've always eventually racked up debts with that nation's currency. When the cost to service that debt became too much and economic conditions worsened because of this, the end result was always the same: enforcing capital controls, as they have every time in the past. The difference this time is that we now have crypto in the picture. And with crypto, you can do just about anything you want with a token issued on a blockchain powered by a smart contract. This means that the issuer of a CBDC could potentially freeze a citizen's wallet and all the money inside of it. And since crypto is programmable money, all kinds of restrictions could be built into the currency that the holders would have no choice but to abide by. But we'll get back to this in a moment. The point is, now you know what central bank digital currencies are. So let's begin our main course. Governments have been releasing research papers on CBDCs for a while now, but one of the first countries to get real attention on the subject was Ecuador. In 2014, the Central Bank of Ecuador released a mobile payment system called the Sistema de Dinero Electrónico, or electronic money system. There was some debate whether this was the first real CBDC, in part due to the fact it was backed by the US dollar opposed to its own national currency. What was not up for debate was that this was an early example of a developing nation, one that was accustomed to using physical cash, being introduced to a new financial system. In the end, the project failed and the government scrapped it in 2018. A year later, in 2015, the UK began showing interest in CBDCs. This can be evidenced by looking at a research paper they released, where they looked deep into the implications of adopting one in the future. 2016 was more the same, with the People's Bank of China announcing that they were looking into blockchain tech as it pertained to digital currencies. This was a strong signal being sent to anyone who was paying attention at the time. The Chinese government was already seriously thinking about the yuan's future as a CBDC. For many cryptonauts, there was a clear double-edged sword forming here. The more prolific crypto became, the better off everyone was. But this also meant that governments were becoming more accustomed to the technology, and by this point, the genie was most definitely out of the bottle. More proof of this arrived in 2017 when the Central Bank of Sweden announced that they were looking into the e-krona. You guessed it, this would be their nation's form of a CBDC as well. Later that year, in November, it was Uruguay's turn. They made global headlines when they announced it would begin a pilot program to test out a new CBDC in the form of the e-peso. 2017 also played host to one of the most spectacular bull markets in crypto history. And this ensured that even small governments around the world were now aware of this monetary revolution. As each year in crypto went by, some of the more advanced nations felt that they had seen enough to justify getting involved themselves. On August 22, 2018, the Central Bank of Thailand announced that they were working on a proof of concept for their own CBDC. Even smaller, more exclusive locations where cash was deeply entrenched started to be impacted. In December of 2019, the Bahamas kicked off their CBDC pilot program, with the currency being called the sand dollar. This small island nation has the distinction of being the first country in the world to launch a central bank digital currency beyond a pilot program. It saw a national rollout in October of 2020. And speaking of 2020, that's when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, putting a major strain on global economies. This was a time period that saw a lot of restrictions on freedoms, and it's become a contentious topic ever since then because of this. During the Freedom Convoy's trucker protests that took place in Ottawa, Canada, in response to the government's handling of the pandemic itself, something very historically relevant happened when it came to money. Despite the fact that it was one of the most peaceful protests in recent memory, the government decided to come down hard on the protesters. In retaliation for protesting, the government froze many of their bank accounts. This put even more strain on some who at that point had lost almost everything. This was a warning shot across the bow. When governments feel enough pressure, they can and will restrict people's freedoms when it comes to money. No matter how you personally feel about how the pandemic was handled, I hope we can agree on at least this one thing. The reality of someone losing access to their money for the simple act of exercising their right to protest should scare everyone. And this is probably a good time to take a short detour. You see, with programmable money on a blockchain, virtually anything is possible. And with potential future where carbon credits are needed to travel, and where there's a social credit score there to rank us in society, as exists today in China, the inclusion of a CBDC to this picture is one that's worth exploring deeper. It's the year 2029, and the Davis family, living in Toronto, Canada, have found themselves in a little bit of a pickle. They live in what is called a 15-minute city, urban planning gone wild. A place where everything a family should need is within a 15-minute walk or bike ride. Your children's school, your supermarket, the pharmacy, hospital, whatever you need. Governments at the local, provincial, and federal level all work together in lockstep to ensure that you had all of the basic essentials. Sometimes there is an emissions fee to pay when you drive outside of your 15-minute city designated zone. And depending on the situation, you need to have clearance to get out. What determines if you have clearance is your social credit score. This is a number that's derived by taking in all different types of aspects of your life and assigning them a value. Be it the apps that you choose to use, the friendships that you choose to hold on social media, or even the types of products that you purchase. All of these things and much more are part of one gigantic system. And depending on the choices that you make, your score can go up or down within that system. The sum of all these areas in your life that are now being measured become your social credit score. For those living in cities, their social credit score determines everything. What type of transportation you can take, what jobs you can hold, level of banking services offered, and even access to physical buildings. Having a direct association with someone who had too low of a score could actually end up hurting your own score too, via a penalty being applied. This system looks to encompass as much of your life as possible. Because if it could monitor it, then it could turn it into some kind of data within the system, which meant yet another part of your life was now being ranked. But for the most part, people that lived in the cities were willing to accept this new system. The ones who refused to take part in it moved away, often up north, where it was remote with very little infrastructure in place. These cities were places where everything was interconnected and tracked, and it was able to offer some pretty nice conveniences to those who were willing to make the obvious trade-off here. Powering this interconnected economy was, of course, a central bank digital currency. Running on its own blockchain, the government now had the Canadian dollar converted into a cryptocurrency that was powered by a smart contract. No physical cash existed anymore, having been completely phased out the year prior despite considerable public backlash. The government could program the Canadian dollar to have all kinds of neat bells and whistles. They could restrict how much money a citizen could spend each day from their government-issued wallet. They could also enforce how far away from a citizen's home address any amount of money could be spent. When it was tax time, the ever-increasing amount that citizens were paying was simply taken from their account. They didn't have to wait to get paid. It just happened, because the government wanted it to. There was no more financial privacy anymore. And this worked great because every transaction a citizen made was then, of course, tracked on the blockchain. And that meant that it was data that could ultimately be fed into the system. The Davis family were one of many that accepted the trade-offs of living in a 15-minute city. But they mostly stayed because they didn't want to move out of Toronto, which they loved. However, over time, the amount of restrictions on freedoms was starting to become too much. Parents Ben and Lisa had 2 children, Mark, who was 14, and Devin, who was 11. Ben and Lisa appreciated the ability to restrict what types of products Mark and Devin could buy with their allowance. And of course, their allowance came in the form of the Canadian dollar, like you'd expect. In their own digital wallets, both Ben and Lisa had parental controls over their children's wallets. This allowed them to determine when, where, and how much money their children could spend. But this programmable money thing was now impacting both of them negatively. A few weeks prior, there was a political post that went up on Facebook. It was criticizing the effort the local government had been putting into fixing up certain areas of town, which they had promised. Ben and Lisa both agreed with the sentiment here that the government had not been holding up their end of the bargain. They both ended up liking the post and moving on with their day. 48 hours later, both of them received a notification in their wallet app letting them know that they had been flagged for undesirable behavior. The post had ended up going viral, creating quite a stir. This was the government's way of making an example out of those who were bold enough to openly criticize them. They were both being penalized, which started with a reduction in their social credit scores, which admittedly was minor. What was more severe, though, was the penalties associated with their money. For the next month, they would both have a spending limit of no more than $200 every 24 hours. Beyond that, there was a restriction now applied on what types of products they could purchase. The app produced a penalty code for them and a link to a chart, and that chart showed all the other penalty codes and the restrictions associated with them. Ben and Lisa had been willing to put up with a serious erosion of their freedoms of privacy for a while now, because in return they were getting some luxuries. But now, with each passing month, the idea of living in the city felt like a pretty bad deal. Plus, with these restrictions in place, Ben and Lisa were now at real risk of not being able to make rent. This was their breaking point. Knowing that they simply couldn't just get up and leave, they put together a plan. Rent would be paid, but after that, they would be heading up north to Ben's brother's vacant cottage on Manitoulin Island. There was plenty of space up there, tons of underground economies that were flourishing without the use of the dollar, plus no 15-minute cities. The kids had always wanted to move up there, and with Ben and Lisa's jobs being online, this idea was actually possible. They could stay at the cottage for a few months if needed, until they found a rental up there to call home. Because they wanted to leave town right away but hadn't given their 2 months notice to their landlord, they paid 1 month's rent and gave up their security deposit. Being able to pull this off felt great, but it hadn't left very much money in their wallets. They did have some investments if they absolutely had to sell, but those two were now restricted, so it didn't really matter in the end. Finally, the day had arrived when it was time to leave. After packing up everything that mattered, they got in the car and sped off to the local grocery store. Being as frugal as possible, only the most essential items were purchased. This would ensure that they had enough money left to pay for gas costs, as they had an 8-hour drive ahead of them. As they approached one of the designated exits of their 15-minute city, a feeling of tension rushed over Ben and Lisa. They had never been in this position before, being heavily punished by the system. What if they no longer had clearance to leave? As they drove up, Ben held his breath and Lisa closed her eyes. A few seconds later, and they both burst into a nervous laughter. They had just successfully cleared the only hurdle they'd have to deal with. Having left town with a full tank of gas, the family had been on the road for about 4 hours before the vehicle was almost running on empty. They pulled into the first gas station they saw, getting out of the car and walking over to each other with big smiles on their faces. There was a sense of adventure in the air, and more importantly, they were taking the first step towards liberating themselves. Ben's family, along with many of his friends, had moved north years ago when the 15-minute cities and CBDCs first started rolling out. They just weren't the type that was ever going to accept that, at least not without a fight. To Ben, Lisa, and even the children, living up north meant freedom. Every moment was private, like it used to be. Nature was everywhere, and nothing was tracking your movements, communications, and behaviors. Plus, there was a thriving underground economy where people traded everything from lumber to organically grown canned foods. The items you could get up north were unheard of at this point. It was exhilarating just thinking about it all. They had taken a big risk. Governments greatly discouraged it, often demonizing the people who did decide to leave. Plus, there were always the stories out there about other people who had tried to do it, and for one reason or another, just weren't able to pull it off. But none of this mattered now because the Davis family was just mere hours away from true freedom. Ben had calculated the cost of the trip almost perfectly. This left just enough money in his wallet to pay for the gas that would be needed to take them the full distance. Governments have been putting oppressive taxes on gasoline as a means to incentivize people to convert from a gas-powered car over to an electric. Gas was expensive, and it would pretty much clean Ben's account out. As he inserted his debit card and began to pump, he heard an odd-sounding beep. Lisa looked over at the screen, her smile changing into one of utter shock. Ben, not being able to get an answer out of her, looked over at the screen himself to see what it said. Payment error 143, restriction, maximum spending distance reached, 15 miles. Please refer to your wallet notifications for further details. Now, what I just shared with you, of course, is a fictional tale that assumes a lot of things that may never happen. But China's been running a social credit system for years now. Canada started rolling out 15-minute cities, and as we know, central bank digital currencies are a very real thing. And so are the government's desires to control every aspect of our life. Now, with the ability to program money to encourage people to behave a certain way, after COVID-19, I think this makes a lot of people rightfully wary. The plan for this all, as per the World Economic Forum, is global in scope. This all ties into the Great Reset, where in the future, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy about it. So, just to be clear, for anyone to believe that none of this was actually happening would make them a conspiracy theorist at this point. Look, I'm not here to try and scare you about CBDCs, because ultimately, we all have to make our own decisions about what trade-offs we're going to accept. What I am here to tell you is that I've consulted with many world governments in the past on CBDCs, and each time they got giddy with excitement at the thought of 100% tax compliance. They also love the fact there won't be any more bank runs, because there won't be any physical cash to run away with. So, if they rack up crazy debts and start devaluing the currency, with your purchasing power along with it, there's really not much you can do about it. In the end, it's all going to come down to control. If governments work for and with the people, then maybe CBDCs could evolve to be a good thing. But if governments continue to pursue their own interests and ignore the wishes of the masses, then CBDCs could become a form of digital shackles. And I don't know about you, but I'm the type of man that would rather have my freedoms than trade them for a perceived increase in security.
They're constantly monitored by facial recognition cameras that are able to instantly put a face to a name. Now, the Chinese are also ranked, given a mark out of a possible 950 points. A score in the 700s is considered good. Around the 500 mark is not. For now, the number is a sort of bank credit rating, keeping track of everyone's spending habits.
I think being ranked is a good thing. A society has to have rules.
It forces us to be well behaved.
It may seem scary, but it's just like that here. We're used to it, and anyway, we don't have a choice.
Life is to be lived. Think about the lion at the zoo, in his cage. He's reached the point in his life where he's achieved 100% security, sharing in none of the concerns his fellow lions out in the savannah have. And yet, he looks sad. He's unhappy for a reason, because to gain all this security, in turn, he lost all of his freedoms. So, while he sits in his cage, comfortable with his daily feedings, his brothers and sisters are out there running free, just as God intended. And so, we are now just left with one question. When the time comes, and trust me, it's coming, what are you going to decide? For humanity's sake, I pray that collectively, we all choose right. I hope you enjoyed today's stroll down memory lane. Until next time, have fun and enjoy life, my friends. I'll be back soon with another incredible story to tell you.